Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started here in just a moment. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the COVID-19 Military Support Town Hall, hosted by the COVID-19 Military Support Initiative. This initiative is being organized by the Association of Defense Communities and Blue Star Families. This is Matt Boren, Executive Director of the Association of Defense Communities. For over 40 years, ADC has been supporting the resilience of communities and states that support America's military. With nearly 300 communities, states, regions, and affiliated industry organizations, ADC represents every major defense community and state in the nation. The COVID-19 Military Support Initiative will provide resources and expertise to support communities, states, and military families throughout this crisis, including hosting events like today, a daily newsletter, and a new website that was just finalized this afternoon. This website is dedicated to the COVID Military Support Initiative. We developed this site in a matter of days to make sure we had a single place for our military community to access information and resources about our work and everything happening with this crisis. On this site, you will find links to our pain points poll, news coverage from our daily update, and information about upcoming events. We also have a robust resource library that will provide you with easy access to a variety of resources we are identifying in real time. Please visit www.covid19militarysupport.org to view this new resource. Now I'll turn it over to my battle buddy, Kathy Roth-Duquette, who has a few announcements to make. Kathy?
Thanks so much, Matt, and thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. As Matt said, I'm Kathy Roth-Duquette, the CEO and co-founder of Blue Star Families. Blue Star Families is a national nonprofit dedicated to supporting the active duty, Guard, and Reserve military members and their families, veterans and their families from all ranks and services. I want to start out with a new and exciting announcement for us this afternoon. I'm elated to announce that Booz Allen Hamilton is our newest and largest sponsor. Booz Allen has been a steadfast supporter of our military community. We are so happy to have their support of this important work. Thank you, Booz Allen. Additionally, I would like to mention and thank USAA. We are so grateful for their major support. And I'd also like to acknowledge our additional supporters, the Bristol-Myers Squibb Foundation, the Association of Military Banks of America, Military Housing Association, Hunt Companies, and First Command. We're honored to be recognized and supported by these great partners. None of what we're working hard to do would be possible without them. Back over to you, Matt, who will give a little more background on today's topic and introduce our first set of panelists.
All right, thanks, Kathy. And this is meant to be an interactive town hall, and we want your questions. If you have any queries that have not been addressed throughout the discussion, please submit it through the chat page that's located in the webinar, or email info@defensecommunities.org. Our panelists will do their best to field a few questions, time permitting. Any questions that do not get addressed will be downloaded by our team, and we will work to get answers to those queries and get that information up on our website. Please be patient as we are navigating through information that is frequently changing, and we want to be sure we provide the most up-to-date and accurate answers. Now let's dive into this afternoon's discussion. Like everyone else in America, the defense industrial base is still reeling from how quickly COVID-19 went from a potential issue to a nation-shuttering pandemic. Supply chain issues, possible reduced demand, both domestically and globally, and uncertainty as how local, state, and federal governments will respond to the crisis are all placing immense pressure upon the defense industry sector. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into these issues, what it means for DoD, our communities, and ultimately service members and their families. We will also discuss strategies for working together to weather this crisis and look toward recovery. To help us understand all of this, we've assembled an outstanding group of experts. Dr. Ram Bala, Professor of Business Analytics at the Levy School of Business at Santa Clara University. Lieutenant General Chris Bogdan, U.S. Air Force retired, and Senior Vice President at Booz Allen Hamilton. And Mike Gilroy, Program Director for the Defense Industry Resilience Program at the DoD Office of Economic Adjustment. Wesley Hallman, Senior Vice President for Policy with the National Defense Industry Association. And Bob Ross, Executive Director of the Connecticut Office of Military Affairs. So let's get started. Dr. Bala, I'm going to start with you. On a macro level, how has COVID-19 impacted our supply chains?
Thank you, Matt. Let me first give a very quick background on what I do. So as you know, I'm a professor at Santa Clara University in business analytics and supply chain. What I really focus on in applying data analysis to making supply chains more efficient and resilient. And I've been doing consulting for logistics companies for a long time and retail companies as well. What I've also been interested in is how these things affect our communities and society at large for the last few years. Addressing your question, how are things being affected by COVID-19? I would say that supply chains are the level of risk and volatility that supply chains are facing has significantly gone up. And I would like to focus on, I would like to call out specific risks that supply chains are facing. So there is demand side risk, which is of three different forms. Either demand for certain products has suffered a complete outage. For some products, demand has gone through the roof, and it's not clear when it's going to stabilize. And anything that's remaining that's essential, demand is whipsawing or oscillating, which means that there are these huge surges of demand, but then it falls off, and it's becoming very difficult to manage. The same set of issues is also you can see on the supply side, and as a result, matching supply and demand for any business has become very, very hard. It's hard. It's become expensive. And the third thing I want to call out is the structural risk that supply chains are facing. And there are two kinds of risk I want to focus on. One is the fact that every organization is and should be concerned about the fact that a certain percentage of their workforce might get ill at some point of time, and that would lead to significant business continuity issues. And that's something that everyone has to be aware of. Large organizations obviously are putting plans in place, but this will affect small and medium enterprises, businesses disproportionately. The other structural risk that I see has got to do with cybersecurity. Given that a lot of businesses have actually gone online and doing a lot of work online, there is an increasing incidence of cybersecurity incidents that are happening. You might have heard of Zoom bombing, where people are using Zoom and there are these attacks or hacks that are actually happening. And so that's another risk that has also gone up. And all of these need to be addressed. They need to be addressed systematically by looking at exactly how it's going, what needs to be done to match these challenges.
Thanks, Dr. Bala. Wes Hallman over at NDIA. What are the impacts we're seeing to small businesses and the lower tier subcontractors?
Well, first off, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here and speak on behalf of that. As you know, NDIA is, we cover all sectors, all sizes of the defense industrial base, but we very much skew to smalls, with over 75% of our members being small businesses. To that end, we at NDIA actually pushed out a small business survey that opened about a week and a half ago. It remains open until the 10th of April, but I will tell you some of the results that we've seen already. The demographics, we've had about 750 respondents thus far, so a very large an active group of folks that have come in and filled out the survey. There's both qualitative and quantitative questions on there. Well over half of the representative businesses are $5 million in annual revenue or less, and over 70% of the respondents have less than 50 employees. Of that, so that kind of bounds what kind of data, what kind of company we brought in data from. And by far their biggest impact that they're seeing is on their revenue expectations. So this goes towards what Dr. Bala was saying in supply chain risk. And these, as you drive down into the lower tiers of the supply chain, you're invariably going to end up with a large population of small businesses. So contractors are expecting to see major impacts to their ability to perform on contract, what their access to capital is, and to the doctor's point, the availability of their workforce over time. When the respondents were asked about the availability of costs and of materials, et cetera, these were least impacted, but our initial analysis is that that's due to we hit this crisis with essentially full warehouses. And so as this crisis, as we move through it, as we get towards the back end of it, that may or may not be the case as we get towards the end. Over 60% of our small businesses have experienced a disruption in cash flow as a result of COVID-19 crisis. Most commonly reported are cuts to their billable hours, delayed payments from larger contractors, and importantly, government customers due to shutdown or telework, or a lack of telework options or schedule flexibility in contracts. And importantly, about 30% of our respondents expect to experience overruns, not just in their in the schedule of their performance on contracts, but also cost, especially in their fixed price contracts. Most of those within that grouping that are seeing those cost overruns are looking at anywhere between 10 and 20%, whether it's due to labor issues, whether it's due to we have one company who is on a construction contract that needed to barge in material. Those barges were turned away due to COVID-19 restrictions, and each one of those barge trips was $2.5 million just for the trip, not counting the materials that were on it. So you can see if you're on a firm fixed price contract, you're going to be upside down pretty quickly in something like that. And then 51% of the folks that answered have experienced a disruption in their ability to perform on contract as a result of shelter in place orders or the related. Again, we have several qualitative things, so those are harder to analyze yet until we close this out and are able to do some data analysis using some data mining techniques. But as you can see, it's not just impactful in what's said here, but also what you get across the board is a certain level of uncertainty that is pervading the community.
Thanks, Wes. General Bogdan, this next one's for you. As all of you know, last week Congress passed a historic $2 trillion stimulus package. What are the concerns for companies like Booz Allen and smaller companies in the defense supply chain? What will it take to make sure everyone gets through this?
Thanks, Matt. I want to thank everyone for joining today's town hall. In addition to working at Booz Allen and being a retired 3-star general, I'm proud to say that I'm on. I sit on the board of directors of Blue Star Families, and ADC and Blue Star are just doing an outstanding job. And I want to thank Matt and Kathy for your initiative here. Relative to the question on the $2 trillion CARES Act, let me provide a little background for everyone so we can understand what it is and how it got here. The CARES Act is actually the third piece of legislation enacted in the past 45 days. There was a phase one called Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Act, which authorized $80.3 billion for various healthcare issues. There was a second act called the Families First Act that had a lot of provisions in it about taking care of families during this COVID-19 pandemic, although there was no money associated with that act, and many of the provisions of that act have been rolled into and funded in the $2 trillion CARES Act. So the $2 trillion CARES Act is over 900 pages. It is a complex law and a complex series of provisions and legislation, and it will challenge anybody to read it and understand it. So let me highlight some of few provisions in that law that may be of interest to companies that are listening in today. For all employers, regardless of your size and regardless of the industry you're in, there are provisions in the law for payroll tax delays and deferrals. There are tax filing changes, and there are employee retention credits that could be of interest to you. For mid-size and larger employers, that's usually in companies over 500 people, there are loans, loan guarantees, and other Federal Reserve credits that will become available. And for small businesses, there's a Paycheck Protection Program. There's a Small Business Administration Injury Disaster Loan Program. There's a Paid Sick Leave Provision Act, which came from Phase 2 that is now funded. And there's a Paid Family Leave provision from Phase 2 that's also funded. And for those defense industrial-based companies, you might have seen the letter in which much of the supply chain in DoD has been designated as essential. And with that comes some added policies, protections, and programs that are being spelled out by DoD. Probably one of the best places for any company out there, defense industrial-based company out there, is to go to the DAU website, where I believe DoD is putting all the DoD policies and memos and aggregating them in one place, so you can see all the things that DoD is trying to work with the defense industrial base. Now to the biggest concerns for this act and for companies out there. In the short term, just like Booz Allen, questions like, how do I meet my payroll and pay for my monthly overhead expenses? Can I keep my company open? Do I need to lay people off? How can I continue to do business while keeping my employees safe? I'll provide a few ideas in which Booz Allen has enacted and a few ideas that I've seen and heard from many other companies to give you some ideas of how in the short term they're dealing with some of this. The first thing I've seen is some companies are activating multiple work streams to protect their workforce. They're going to shift work, and that is so that they can spread their employees out over their facilities so they can maintain the 6-foot distance rule. I've seen other companies stand up small crisis management teams to continually communicate with their employees. There's an awful lot of companies that are working with the government and with their primes so that they can do remote and telework. One of the things I've seen that's very important for Booz Allen is for those employees that actually have to go to the facility, whether it be a government facility or a Booz Allen facility, especially in states where there's some sort of lockdown or shutdown, we provided letters to our employees so that if they get stopped and law enforcement wants to know why they're on the road, they can show them a letter that says they are part of the essential defense industrial base and move along to get to their place of employment. I've also seen companies implementing resiliency programs that consider things like employee health benefits, time off benefits, and daycare considerations, all within the construct of the CARES Act, which will protect and reimburse many companies for those kinds of activities. Other things I've seen companies wrestling with is, what is the cost of furloughing my people and then having to regenerate and restart that staff once the pandemic is over, and weighing that against the short-term furloughs? What are the costs of restanding the businesses up? The other thing that I'd like to mention, which is very interesting, and I've heard DoD talk about this, the leadership in DoD, is the concern that firms must be aware of the possibility of adversaries injecting capital into businesses to keep them afloat, and what the long-term implications of that are downstream. But I will tell you, most of all, what I've learned from Booz Allen, from talking to other companies in the supply chain, is that employees are looking for your active leadership. They're looking for you to communicate, and be as transparent as you can. I think it's also an imperative for all of you to basically understand what the government is providing in terms of aid and relief for you, so you can make the best decisions for your companies. Town halls like this and resources like the military initiative, as well as organizations like NDIA and AIA and your state and local governments have lots and lots of websites and information. So I would recommend that you keep keep up and learn as much as you can. Finally, the last thing that I'm most concerned about is what I call the effects of the pachinko machine. So at the very top level in the federal government, there are lots of different colored marbles and sized marbles going into a pachinko machine. And those marbles are moving down the machine. And what we need to try and make sure is that the right color marbles and the right size marbles end up in your hands as leaders of the business community so that you can help your employees and help your communities. And that has to be done fairly quickly. The only way that I can see that happening is if state and local governments work together with organizations like ADC and Blue Star Families and NDIA and linking them up with industry and other local programs to be able to make sure that at the very top level, when things are flowing down through complicated laws, that they really turn into action and aid and relief for those at the local level. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions later. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, General. I appreciate it. Mike Gilroy, I think this is kind of a perfect opening for the question I have for you. And that's, how can communities and states better understand what support local defense contractors and suppliers need? And ultimately, what types of resources are available to help them do this?
Well, General Bogdan mentioned the first resource, and that's the stimulus bill. But for those of your audience who are unfamiliar with OEA, we tend to be the source of first resort in situations like this. My program line, the Industry Resilience Program line, provides resources to states and communities to handle negative defense impacts. That could be everything from personnel reduction to a merger and acquisition that cuts production through the cancellation of a weapons system. We're allowed to go in and assist communities. And it's only, we only work with governments. And so if you are a state or local government person in the audience, I would suggest you copy down our website, oea.gov, and go peruse that to see if we might be of use to you at some point in the future. But the first thing you need to do in order to figure out where to plug in resources, be they federal or state, is you need to find your defense supply chain. And it sounds simple. You know, you could go do a query on the Federal Procurement Data System, and there's the universe of your defense manufacturers. But that's not really it. There's, you know, there are multiple starting points. We funded a lot of projects in the last probably 5 or 6 years dedicated to finding a supply chain at the state level. And every one of our grantees who undertook that activity found out that it's not as simple as it sounds. There are multiple sources out there. It's a moving target. Sometimes getting cooperation from manufacturers is an issue because they view information they give to either me as a federal agency or a state government as giving away a piece of their competitive advantage. So this is the first thing someone at the state government should be doing to determine where they can bring the assets to bear. And there are significant assets out there, but the key is to finding where you got to plug a hole and what the actual issue is. And the only way you get to do that is by examining your defense supply chain at as small a level as you can get away with. OEA provides some guidance and resources like that. Every year we publish a defense spending by state report, but this is a 70,000-foot view. It's really just designed to show you where your hot spots are because we don't really drill down. We encourage everyone at the state level to then take that report and take the next step and go find out where the cash flows are and who your manufacturers are, right down to the census tract level if you can do it. Dr. Bala mentioned another issue, and that is one of cybersecurity. For those who may be unaware, the Department of Defense changed its cybersecurity posture in contracting a couple of years ago. And it updated a clause in the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement that, in short, said if you can't meet a given level of cybersecurity hygiene, you can't do business with DoD. Some manufacturers to this day still think that's not an issue, But I think one of the things the COVID-19 drill that we're undergoing right now is highlighted is that cybersecurity is a big deal, because now folks are forced into telework or are forced to do more over the internet than they ever had before. And the threat was already high before in the defense manufacturing sector. It's going to be even higher now, because when you're in crisis, this is the time for an adversary to take a shot at you. So OEA has also provided assistance in this area. We up to this point in time, we've really only done it at the state level, but probably the bulk of my industry resilience portfolio right now, the active projects, are really cybersecurity projects designed to get small and mid-sized defense manufacturers up to speed with the DFARS clause and the NIST 800-171 cyber hygiene standard. And then most of the folks that we have projects with are also now flexing their effort to the cybersecurity maturity model certification that the department rolled out in January. So those, if I would, my advice to state governments is, if you're not really sure where to start, we're probably a good place to start. And we're happy to talk to anybody on a conference call and share some of the information we've developed over 5-6 years, working really closely with the defense manufacturing sector at the state level.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. And like you said, you've been doing this, administering this program for the last 5 or 6 years. Can you talk a little bit about some of the big trends or best practices that you've seen states come up with?
If my gold standard on a cybersecurity project is still state of California, Governor's Office of Planning and Research set up a program called Cascade, just like it sounds. So you can Google California Cascade and OPR. They'll take you right to their website. This was an effort to map the state's defense sector to find out where their suppliers were, to map the cybersecurity market to find out where the assets were that could plug cybersecurity holes once the defense manufacturers found them. And then they engaged their local manufacturing extension partnership affiliate, CMTC, down in Los Angeles to deliver the training. They did that in partnership with Defense Acquisition University West and Defense Contract Management Agency West. So you had a whole of government response dedicated to helping small and mid-sized defense manufacturers get up to speed on cybersecurity. But I mentioned that it started with a supply chain mapping effort, so they knew, so they could figure out who they had to go after. So almost everything you would do in an industry resilience scenario, at least through our agency, starts with finding that defense supply chain. So that's a cybersecurity best practice. That we have other workforce development projects. The state of Utah, through the University of Utah, was looking to create a workforce development program for the area around Hill Air Force Base when it took on the F-35 sustainment mission, because there weren't a lot of folks familiar with composites and some of the other features of the F-35 that are unique. So University of Utah led that effort to increase the supply of folks who were familiar with those technologies. Those are two I can think of off the top of my head.
Great, thanks, Mike. And I think a lot of these case studies can be found on your website, is that correct?
There's a fair amount of them there. We just updated our website, and I probably got 10 or 15 up right now. But you will see the entirety of my current 52 active project portfolio over the course of the next few months.
Great. We'll make sure to get a link up on our new website so we can start directing folks your way. This next question is for Bob Ross. Bob, from your position in state government, how is this all playing out on the ground? What impacts are you seeing to defense industry in Connecticut? And what steps are you taking at the state and local level?
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me. New England, where Connecticut is a unique place because it's a bunch of small states that share borders, and there's a lot of mobility between our states. The national response to this, we all know, was kind of a rocky start and pretty slow. But here in New England, the governors of Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey early on knew they had to collaborate with each other because so many people move in and out of New York City through New Jersey and Connecticut. They work in the city, but they live in these states, and they knew that they had to make sure that whatever they were going to do, they had to do it together so that as people were moving back and forth, they weren't having to switch between rules. So before the governor released his first executive order, he called all the major defense prime contractors in the state, talked to their leadership to make sure that he knew what they were worried about and what they think they need. And to also make sure that they knew in advance of anything that was going to come out in an executive order. Their concerns were first and foremost that they be given explicit identification as firms that are essential. They didn't want people trying to figure that out. So we made sure in the very first executive order that talked about starting to restrict mobility, that defense industry and the military were considered essential. The other thing that we're doing is that kind of communication has continued on. We have a conference call with the industry leaders every other day from the governor's office to make sure that that is continuing, that they get to know in advance what's coming next, and we get to hear them tell us what their concerns are. I did check in just today with our largest defense contractor in the state, and the feedback I got was that they're in pretty good shape, that there's a lot of programs out there to help all of these smaller firms. And they've also been told by DOD that DOD is very sensitive to this. And so if you're having a small supplier that is in difficulty, DOD is standing by to work that problem through the prime contractor. So if you think about what Mike Gilroy just said, some of these major firms see their supplier base as proprietary information. And so sometimes some of us on the outside are going to have a hard time figuring out how to map that out at the lower levels. But the primes don't have a problem with that. They know who they are. And so one of the ways to look at this problem is if you want to try to help address the lower tier problem before it becomes a problem, is to try to work a solution through the prime. The prime's going to know when they've got a supplier that's having trouble, and you can work a potential solution through the prime contractor. One of the things that's unique about Connecticut is that I think we might be the only state in the country that has said all manufacturing is considered essential work. So it's not just the defense industry, but we see all manufacturing as essential. What's unique about the defense industry is they have contracts in hand. They're being paid. The demand has not changed for their product. And that's unique about the defense industry. The other manufacturers are going to see demand fall off for their products. So we look at the defense industry as in all of this great uncertainty, there's some certainty there that we ought to be tapping into. And I think the biggest challenge for our primes is, and it was alluded to before, is managing that anxiety that the workforce feels about going to work, and balancing that against the fact that we have to keep these defense projects moving forward. So it's a big leadership challenge. And the primes are doing a good job of coming up with flexible work schedules, balancing requirements with that employee anxiety, and then also because kids are at home in all of these families, figuring out how to help families deal with kids at home and homeschooling, and still try to get work done. So having flexible work hours seems to be something that is very popular, so that somebody can be home helping a kid with homeschooling during the day and then go to work at 6 o'clock at night to try to catch up on not being there during the day. And then I want to go back to that whole issue of supply chain crossing borders. Just like our employees in the major companies, our commuters that cross borders, I think as we move forward, we're going to encounter more and more difficulties with travel restrictions on a state-by-state basis. So I know anecdotally, we just had a big job that had to be done in Florida. Florida had this 14-day quarantine order for anybody coming from this part of the country. And so trying to work through those blanket restrictions, I think, is going to become more and more challenging over time.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate that. Dr. Bala, I want to go back to you. Given all we've just heard, which impacts to the supply chain are likely to be temporary and which are permanent? I imagine that this is maybe upset the regular order of things, not just now, but looking into the future.
Thanks, Matt. I think the way I look at it, anything. We can come up with examples, and but basically anything that's being, any sort of shift that's being driven by panic at this point is really temporary, as compared to shifts that are not driven by panic, but driven by an essential change in the way we live and do our work. So to give you an example, I think there has been a lot of press about toilet paper shortages, but I think that's a lot of it is driven by panic. I don't think our supply chain for toilet paper is actually is struggling. At the same time, cleaning supplies, for example, I think that's going to be a permanent shift, right? So that's something that's going to, a lot more of it is going to get used, and it's going to take some time for the entire supply chain for cleaning supplies to actually catch up. And we have to remain, the demand for that is not going to drop anytime soon. I think so Bob Ross had brought up a different point, which is very interesting, which has to do with the fact that how do we manage our supply chains domestically versus globally? While one could imagine that, I don't think it'll go back to business as usual when it comes to global supply chains. I think we are going to see every organization having to look at their supply chains very carefully, think about what's the most critical, and localize some of those critical supply chains, because there are going to be significant barriers coming up for the foreseeable future in terms of how things move across borders, for example. And so I think what's important is for every organization to kind of look at every product that they buy and sell, as well as sort of how their supply chain is structured, and think about what is it that's driven by panic and what is it that's going to stay for the long term, because we are trying to deal with this pandemic. Because clearly no one believes that this is going to be done in the next couple of months. Maybe our lockdowns might sort of ease a little bit, but at the same time, I think a lot of these restrictions in some form or the other are going to remain. And so we'll have to find a way to deal with that in the best possible way. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Doctor. So I have one final question before we get to the audience questions, and this is to the group. What does a recovery plan look like? What are the next steps for Congress, for DoD, for groups like NDIA and ADC and Blue Star Families? How do we get back to making sure we have a robust defense industrial base that can support the needs of DoD in this country?
Yeah, this is Chris Bogdan. As Dr. Bala said, some things are going to be temporary, but one of the things that I don't think will be temporary, and what will be an aspect of the recovery, is companies are going to need to think about how they can become more resilient in the face of anything: a war, a border shutdown, a COVID-19 pandemic, an earthquake, a natural disaster where some of their key suppliers are located. I think the role that DoD has to play in that is, and the federal government is, if we want our defense supply chain to be more resilient to these kinds of things, these external events that could happen, then they're probably going to need to fund some kinds of programs to do that, as well as provide some kind of ideas and notions as to what certain industries' resiliency ought to look like. And I'll stop there and let the other panelists discuss. But I think that's going to be an element of moving forward.
Yeah, and this is Wes Hallman of NDIA. I think that's a great question, and obviously the key first answer is how we deal with the crisis as we're going through it. As you know, we've advocated for and there's been good rundowns of the various policies, et cetera, that have come out, whether it's through the legislative actions that have been taken, or as many of you may know, Ellen Lord's team in acquisition and sustainment under the Office of the Secretary of Defense has done an outstanding job of reaching out to industry, and we've been having every other day calls with her office, bringing up our memberships, and then this is across multiple associations. I think 10 associations have been participating in those, bringing up the various issues that the entire defense industrial base has been dealing with in every aspect of the supply chain. And so many of the things that we've talked about have been addressed in those, and the more we can mitigate during the crisis, the less rebuilding or recovery we have at the end of these. I will say that in talking to our larger OEMs, they're extremely concerned with keeping their supply chains intact because they understand they have to perform on contract when they get to the end of this. So they're incentivized to push. So both DoD is trying to accelerate payments, and then the larger OEMs are trying to accelerate payments to their lower tier suppliers in order to keep them healthy. And the bottom line is that recovery is going to be a lot easier if we're able to keep that in track by keeping that supply chain intact, by accelerating the flow of cash through that supply chain. That said, on the backside of this, we really have to do a overarching assessment of what remains and where the vulnerabilities still exist to understand what investments need to be made to shore up and rebuild the supply chain where it became weak or where portions of it were broken down. And with that, I'll let somebody else answer.
Hey, Matt, this is Bob Ross in Connecticut. So if I could just use a little analogy to illustrate a point that Dr. Bala just made. When we look at the last 30 years or so, and DoD was undertaking this huge reassessment of where bases were located, and we went through several BRAC processes, and there was good reasoning for moving stuff out of New England to other lower cost locations, and it was an economic decision with big political ramifications. Nobody back then was talking about sea level rise. Now we're confronting sea level rise at locations all over both coasts. And there's this thinking that, maybe we're going to have to move stuff to other places around the country that has higher elevation because the framework, the context of the decision making changed. I think we're going to see that here. I think after we get through this, the way we have behaved over the years in major projects is to have a diversified supply chain from all over the country. So every congressional district has a legitimate interest in a major defense program. So you've got advocates everywhere. That made perfect sense when you're trying to build political support for certain things. But now maybe we're going to have to look back at that and say, is that wise to have our supply chain geographically spread out across the entire country? Are we going to learn something here that suggests that maybe that strategy made sense a couple decades ago, but maybe it doesn't make as much sense now? And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bob. Dr. Bala, Mike, any thoughts?
Yes. So one thing. So when we talked about temporary versus permanent changes, I think a lot of what's coming in terms of the stimulus is really to ensure that some of the temporary changes that we are seeing do not affect businesses adversely, in the sense that they don't completely collapse, and hopefully they can weather these shocks. At the same time, in a permanent sense, I think the recovery plan, we have to focus a lot more on, and I think that point has been mentioned already. In supply chains, we always talk about cost, service levels, and resilience. And often resilience was given was not adequately addressed by individual companies, largely because it's about that one black swan incident that's several years away, right? So that's kind of the way we have been individuals and companies have been viewing it, and maybe even policymakers. I think that's got to change, and that's something that every organization has to focus on in trying to understand how one can't. I think in one of the things is we can't be focused just on providing the best service if an outage will completely make us collapse. And so resilience has got to be given a lot more importance, I think, at all levels in terms of how we make decisions and investments. And that's something that that thinking has to be across the board.
Thanks, Dr. Bala. We'll start moving into some of the audience questions, and a lot of these questions are surrounding this idea of essentiality and the declaration of the Defense Industrial Base as critical infrastructure. What does this actually really mean? And really, for the subs of defense of larger defense contractors, how do they make sure they're classified right? Where's the line, and how can we make sure that those who need to be declared essential are?
Hey, Matt, this is Bob in Connecticut again. So, we have the Columbia class program in Connecticut, and the Columbia ballistic missile submarine program is the #1 top priority of all acquisition in the Department of Defense right now. So it's very clear for us that, that is a top priority, and it has to continue to move forward in spite of all the difficulty that we're having. I think it's a great question. I think that there are both real and perceived vulnerabilities out there right now about the nation's security as we have to focus on this crisis. And those vulnerabilities can be exploited. I think DOD pretty much put out a broad blanket statement that everything was essential. And maybe as time goes on, they're going to have to take a look at that and say, well, we can afford some slowdown here or some slowdown there. But I think it would be very wise to rack and stack the major DoD programs. It's a good, fair question.
Yeah, and this is Wes Hallman. I think it is a fair question, and one of the things that you have to remember is that the Defense Industrial Base is not just about producing things, but it's also providing critical services to our warfighters on a continuing basis to ensure readiness. And so as you determine essentiality, I think that needs to come into play also. So yes, we need to continue to produce those priority systems that continue to provide our warfighters with capabilities, today and tomorrow. But it's also about folks that are working with the intelligence community and elsewhere that can't telework and have to have access to secure facilities to carry out an essential mission that is continuing despite the global pandemic. The fact is, our competitors and adversaries haven't stopped attacking us via cyber. They haven't stopped doing nefarious activities overseas. They haven't stopped threatening the ability or the safety of our service members that are serving globally. And so as you look at essentiality, you have to make those kind of determinations. And for all of our companies, realize that it's not an easy choice on whether they send their workforce to work or not. They gotta balance out the risk to that to their workforce and the essentiality of their mission as they determine whether that workforce goes in and puts themselves at risk. This is why one of the things that NDIA has pressed for in our calls with OSD is really a lot more information sharing on the nature of the outbreak, where those are on really an office by office level. We understand their desire to keep aggregate numbers that speak to readiness of our military out of the public eye, but we really need them to share that information with that contract workforce that is working side by side, whether it's in shipyards or whether it's in a skiff, to make sure that we understand what the risk level is, and so we can balance that essentiality with that safety of the workforce. And I'll stop there.
Matt, this is Mike Gilroy. I think this kind of overlaps a little bit with previous comments, but I think the first thing that this crisis has caused people who may not have been in the defense space before to consider is that much more is really national security than just beans and bullets and uniforms and tanks and ships. Services, infrastructure, this is all around national security. So what we at OEA would encourage states to begin thinking about this. This is clearly within our authority to assist with in terms of planning, but if you're going to define essentiality at the manufacturing level, it may behoove governors to look at what else is essential in the national security space, and then what can they do to assist DoD in backstopping it.
All right, thanks all. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Rambala. So I do think, however, that when it comes to essentiality, I think there is a learning curve. Even when I live in California and I think about what has been declared essential versus not. I mean, there is a certain level of feedback that you do end up getting about whether certain things are running as expected or not, and whether that, and I think at some level we're also learning. I think one thing to remember here is that we won't get it all right in the very first shot. I think initially the idea is to kind of declare as many things as essential as we can, but I think and maybe that'll change, and so that's something we have to keep in mind, that there is no magic wand here that will give us the answer. I think it's we have to kind of we have to figure this out as we get feedback as well.
Thanks, Dr. Bala. We've gotten a few questions here, kind of long-term, really forecasting. So I hope all of you can pull out your crystal balls here. What happens if a lot of these smaller manufacturers aren't able to survive through this, and a significant portion of critical manufacturing either is done elsewhere around the globe, or simply ceases to exist on the small and local level? What do we need to do to make sure that those businesses are protected, and then ultimately there is help to get them back on their feet?
Hey, Matt, it's Bob Ross here. I think about this a lot. I know how hard it is for a small company to become a defense supplier. It's not easy, and you have to meet some pretty high bars in cybersecurity and administration and just a number of things, because I see small companies they want to become a lower tier supplier, and it's not easy. And I worry about that if we do lose a lot of these smaller firms, regenerating those firms is going to be very hard. So the more we can do on the front end to prevent them from going under, I think that's the best long-term strategy.
Yeah, this is Chris Bogdan. In my former role, when I was in uniform, I ran the DoD's F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, and we had 10,000 suppliers on that program, with about a quarter to a third of them not in the United States. And the example I will use is we had some critical manufacturing and some critical suppliers in the nation of Turkey. And due to political reasons, now Turkey is not on the F-35 program, and it cost the Defense Department, this happened after I was there, but anecdotally, it costs the department literally hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to reconstitute some of that manufacturing and supply chain capability because Turkey is no longer on the program. That should serve as kind of a warning for what can happen if many of these smaller defense industrial based companies can't keep their doors open and can't keep their critical employees, paid for now with security clearances and with special skills. So I think DoD recognizes that in the senior leadership conversations I have with them. They understand that the best cure in the future is to take care of the businesses now. And I think that they're working towards that. But again, it goes back to the federal government putting in policies, plans, programs, aid in place, and making sure that the mechanisms are there to get down into these smaller businesses. I like the comment before about the prime contractors, because many of our small businesses in the defense supply chain do not have a direct relationship with DoD. They have a relationship with DoD through prime contractors. So it's incumbent upon the prime contractors to make sure that if they understand their supply chains well, and I believe most of them do, that any signs of those problems need to be elevated so that the whole of government and industry can look after that. I'll stop there.
Okay, we've got a few questions here about in times of crisis, is there a way to cut out some of the red tape or relax those requirements? Bob Ross, you talked about how difficult it is to become a defense supplier and a defense contractor. Is there a mechanism that we should be looking at policy-wise that would help waive these in this time of crisis?
Yeah, so I don't know that it would be wise. Those rules are in place for a good reason. I don't know that it'd be wise to relax all those rules, but maybe it would be wise to have people who know how to navigate that really be bumped up to help firms that want to go down that track, so that we don't put the big burden on that small company to figure out how to navigate their way into becoming a supplier. We need to do more to help them, to kind of walk them through it with people who really understand the system. It's like anything else. If you know how it works, it's easy. If you don't know how it works, it's really hard and time consuming.
And this is Wes Holman, and I have to go after this, and I'm sorry, great forum. But one thing I will add to that is this is a unique opportunity to look at our processes and innovate under the current rule set also. So understanding that many of those rules are in there, for a reason. And there's been a lot of efforts over the last several years to significantly ramp up the pace of acquisitions, et cetera. And we fully support that. But under the current rule set, there's a way to innovate under the current rules that lessen the burden or allow us to continue on contract given the restrictions that we have. I will point to DCMA and their efforts to do remote inspections, et cetera, so they continue to give credit to companies that are delivering on contract, even with the restrictions on personnel access and other things through various means, so that they can continue to push payments out to not just primes again, so the primes can push their revenues down to the subs. So those kind of innovations, this is a great time to look at those opportunities and then solidify those when we get to the other side of this crisis. And I'll stop there.
All right, all. Well, we're just about out of time. There are some more questions, but and we'll get those up on the website as soon as we can find some answers to those. So check the website in the coming days, and we'll try to get those questions answered for folks. I also want to let people know that ADC and Blue Star Families were working with organizations like Booz Allen Hamilton, like OEA, like the National Defense Industry Association, and others to discuss and identify possible policies at the federal, state, and local level that can address not just the defense industry supply chain, but a whole manner of issues that are cropping up, from quality of life and infrastructure, all the way down to different programs at the state and local level. So if you want to be a part of that, I encourage you to email us with your ideas and thoughts. And with that, I want to thank all of our panelists. This was a great discussion, and I want to thank the great questions from the audience. Before we sign off, I want to turn it back to Kathy real quick. She has some announcements before we wrap.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to all our panelists. For all of our participants, thanks so much for joining us. Please check your email following the town hall. We'll be sending you a follow-up email with information on this discussion and a post-webinar survey. Please take a moment to take that survey. That input helps us know that we're doing the best possible job replying this information to you and capturing your feedback, helping us to decide what future subjects we should cover. And we'll also send a link to the pain point polls for military families. Please take those yourself if you're a military connected family, or share those with your customers or your community for those that apply. Thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to having you join us on Tuesday, April 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for our next town hall, Managing the Financial Impact of COVID-19 for Military Families. I think that's going to be a fantastic one, and I hope to hear many of you there. Thanks. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you.